Thank you, Brant. Really want to thank you for the extraordinary effort you put into launching what is a major initiative for Hudson Institute. Those of you who don't know Brant, he's the former Associate General Counsel of In-Q-Tel. He's someone with a distinguished record of service at both the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of Defense, serves on numerous federal advisory boards at the Department of State and Commerce, and played a very critical role in the NSC in his last stint there in moving satellites off of the ITAR reg list, which is an important thing for this industry. Hudson Institute is a think tank dedicated to promoting American leadership and global engagement for a secure, free, and prosperous future. Critical to American leadership is American technological leadership, and that's core to our mission, core to what we do. Our founder, Herman Kahn, was a great visionary and saw the interaction between strategy, technology, and demography as critical to shaping the future in ways that nearsighted analysts couldn't imagine. We do significant work on defense transformation, defense trade, on IT, communications, and we're delighted to add space now to this mix and to have such an august group of CEOs, CTOs, thought leaders from the space-related industries here with us today to launch this new and important institutional initiative. I especially want to thank the members of our advisory board, Joe Pelton, Pierre DeVries, Dale Hatfield, all legendary figures in their own right for the significant time they put in. And I also want to most especially thank Hudson Institute trustee, Dr. Margaret Whitehead, for encouraging us to undertake this major initiative on space and to drawing on her insights and her contacts as well. Margaret has been nothing short of a force of nature in moving us forward, and this is as also a labor of love for her. Her late husband, Tom, who was himself a beloved Hudson Institute trustee, was a pioneer and visionary in the satellite world at both Hughes Communications, where he launched the Galaxy satellite system, and with the Société Européenne des Satellites. And on that note, we are especially honored to have Dr. Scott Pace keynote our event today. And he needs no introduction, I think, to those of you who follow space issues. Scott is, of course, the Executive Secretary of the Trump Administration's Space Council, an important new initiative that is putting great emphasis on the future of U.S. endeavors in space. He's the former director of the Space Policy Institute and professor of the practice of international relations at George Washington University. He's held senior positions in the Commerce Department, the White House, and in NASA. Most recently at NASA, he was Associate Administrator of NASA for Program Analysis and Evaluation under NASA Administrator Mike Griffin, himself a good friend of Hudson Institute, who spoke here less than 2 weeks ago in his new capacity as Undersecretary of Defense for Science and Engineering. Now, anyone who has spent time with Dr. Pace knows that Scott is extraordinarily well-suited as a creative and future-oriented thinker to help shape an American strategy that helps shape a U.S. strategy to advance American space capabilities to advance our geopolitical interests. Without any further ado, I want to turn the microphone over to Scott. Okay. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Ken. Great to be here, and particularly, Ken, to bring on behalf of the Chairman of the National Space Council and Vice President Mike Pence, thank you for the opportunity to speak here today about the work of the Council and what we're doing to advance American leadership in civil, commercial, and national security space sectors. There's no doubt that the U.S. is a preeminent spacefaring nation in the world. There's no country more capable in space, nor is there any country that's more reliant on space for its security, its economy, its place in the world. And today, under the leadership of President Trump and Vice President Pence, the United States is leading a return to the moon with international and commercial partners, not just to leave flags and footprints, but to expand the economic sphere of human activity. In contrast to the space race of the 1960s, leadership today is measured by not by what we can do alone, but what we can get others to do with us. And so one of the greatest successes of the International Space Station, for example, is the thousands of close working relationships we have with major spacefaring countries, including Russia. As others are willing to work with us in space, we can create new opportunities to advance our foreign policy and our economic goals. There are more global actors today than ever before, serious and growing counter-space threats from capable adversaries, and private sector capabilities that offer lower costs and higher productivity. As the exploration and utilization of space becomes more complex, however, it's more important than ever that we have a whole-of-government approach that recognizes how space issues cut across a wide range of national interests. International cooperation, space commerce, national security space are all interconnected and part of larger elements of national interest. The early years of the space age saw the creation of several landmark treaties. Some have been an outstanding success, such as the 1967 Outer Space Treaty. Others have been failures, such as the 1979 Moon Agreement, unratified by the major space powers. Some have been fortunately unused, such as the Agreement on the Rescue and Return of Astronauts. Some international legal experts are calling for new treaties today to deal with challenges in space. And the United States, however, does not believe that new treaties are needed, but does believe that we should be working closely with other spacefaring nations to promote norms of safe and responsible behavior in space. And what this means is that rather than a top-down treaty negotiation, we should take more of a bottoms-up approach with civil and commercial space operators to define best practices that can be developed into non-binding voluntary guidelines. As such guidelines become more internationally accepted, nations, including the United States, can then choose to codify these guidelines into national policy, law, and regulation. This positions the United States then to lead international discussions from a pragmatic position of experience and expertise rather than theory and polemics. The Trump administration, under the leadership of the chairman, Vice President Mike Pence, is determined to ensure the United States expands American preeminence in space. The president's decision to reinvigorate the National Space Council after nearly a quarter-century hiatus reflects the administration's resolve to ensure the United States will lead in space. Executive Order 13803, signed by President Trump last summer, creates the framework for our council, and each of the members of the National Space Council in turn represents different aspects of the nation's interests in space. The challenge is to combine and align those sometimes disparate and competing interests into a unified whole. As any of you in the interagency process has ever experienced, you know the process. The administration's goal is for the United States to be the indispensable nation in every space sector, civil, commercial, military. And one of the biggest challenges to ensure that government priorities, policies, and regulations are then supportive and up-to-date and relevant to a changing market, technical innovations, international conditions. And this is the theme, of course, of the 2.0 discussion today, that things outside of the regulatory world are moving much, much, much faster than that regulatory world has ever had to deal with before. And so this is the challenge for a lot of our discussions today. At present, we're focusing, therefore, on the most urgent regulatory reforms, the streamlining of U.S. commercial space launch and reentry regulations at the Department of Transportation and the updating of commercial remote sensing regulations at the Department of Commerce. Now, it's not enough to deal with existing regulations, but also we need enabling regulations that are for new space development, such as satellite servicing, private space facilities, and space mining operations. Now, some of those are farther out, but you can see them coming. It takes a long time. We need to prepare to have them. Rather than so, no regulations is not the answer, but a light touch regulatory environment is what we're trying to create for a more predictable world. The administration has assigned the Department of Commerce the lead for developing and consolidating space regulations not otherwise assigned. So if an activity transits national airspace, though, for example, the Department of Transportation has the lead, as it should, for anything going up and down. The Department of Commerce is responsible for the light touch regulatory structure for all of that which is outside. And of course, we still have the FCC as the independent regulatory agency for spectrum. So we're trying to reduce and consolidate, but we're probably not going to get down to one agency. Now, virtually all private space activities require radio spectrum, as I mentioned. And the FCC, while not a member of the National Space Council due to their independent status, is one where we're strengthening our relationship with them as allowed by law. So improving the form of communications back and forth, and certainly while being respectful of ex parte requirements and such. The United States needs strong and innovative space industries. And if we limit, however, space activities to the activities of governments, we would handicap ourselves and cede a key American strength, which is the private sector. If we unleash private enterprise in partnership with government, there is really no limits to what the U.S. can accomplish. And this is why the Space Council has prioritized the development of policies at the interface of public and private sector interests. These include policies on space traffic management, new space technologies, regulatory reform, and ensuring there are opportunities for private enterprise in space exploration and improving space resilience. So again, as you might have heard recently, discussions about lunar exploration. One of the parts of that story, which is still not fully appreciated, is the range of commercial opportunities that are being provided for sending instruments and so forth to the lunar surface using private partners. Today, space sector revenues continue to be dominated by large aerospace and telecom firms. However, an increasing number of entrepreneurial firms are seeking non-traditional market sectors. And these sectors are experiencing revolutionary change: space launch, remote sensing, global broadband via large constellations, new services such as suborbital and orbital human flight, prospecting, satellite servicing, assembly, and manufacturing. And in this environment, what can we do to preserve the U.S. strategic advantage in space? And the answer is fairly simple. The United States needs to take those actions that help generate our advantage in the first place. That is, leading by example in a stable and transparent regulatory environment with government and industry in partnership. I want to touch just briefly on a few of the sectors that we're working on. In space launch, innovative American companies are changing the character and expectations for launch services. In recent years, for example, SpaceX has helped the U.S. gain back market share against foreign suppliers. In looking at the number of launches, however, taking place, the speed of them, the days of doing a launch and that's it, and then waiting a few months and doing another launch is somewhat gone. So when you look at regulations built for expendable rockets launched a few times a year, they're really not up to the date as to what you need from multiple rockets that are reusable happening. And so we're also looking at trends for more satellite owner-operators for smaller satellites. Market for medium and light lift is growing tremendously. And there's a new energy among launch service providers with new entrants, new vehicles, and new platforms. But again, the same old regulations. So again, as a priority for change, that's one of the first on our plate. Since the first U.S. licenses of commercial remote sensing were issued in 1993, there's been a dramatic increase in access to Earth observation data in a variety of spectral bands, resolutions, and repeat time. New constellations of privately financed remote sensing satellites, both domestic and foreign, also promise an increase in temporal resolution with rapid revisit times. And as one of the guys that was there in '93, I can tell you the regulations we did then are grossly inadequate to what we're trying to do today. So guilty. You know, in the past, only national security organizations fielded extremely high resolution platforms. But that difference, of course, with the commercial sector is continuing to erode. And in some cases, temporal resolution, revisit times that the private sector is offering are capabilities that have really never been available before. So it's producing a new challenge of understanding how to assess those capabilities. And while the U.S. has pioneered the development of a licensing regime for commercial remote sensing, technical and market innovations have made it difficult for NOAA to keep up. New license applications involving large numbers of satellites, new technologies are straining the ability of NOAA to meet its compliance requirements. New capabilities such as hyperspectral imaging, full motion video, in-space imaging are taking longer to assess, and we simply can't take that long. If we want to make sure the United States continues to be an attractive home for commercial remote sensing, we need to make sure that our licensing regime is supportive, and we can't take this for granted. Because these companies need stability and predictability that can only come through a responsive and open government decision-making process. We can have another discussion about how satellite communications licensing migrated offshore and what might be done to attract that back to the U.S. So no one should take remote sensing for granted. The space environment is becoming increasingly contested, that these trends present challenges for safety and stability, sustainability. Again, sounds like alliteration, not too much, but today the Department of Defense tracks over 20,000 space objects, and that number will increase dramatically as space situational awareness and things such as capabilities such as Space Fence begin operation. Now, established companies, Boeing, Telsat, newcomers, Samsung, OneWeb, LaserLight, SpaceX, all have announced plans to launch large constellations. Many thousands of these are planned, several of them are already in orbit. And as the number of observable objects in space increases, both the probability of collisions and also the competition for spectrum allocation for commercial endeavors will become more intense. Now, this dramatic increase in the volume of commercial space assets exposes deficiencies in our current process for managing space traffic and spectrum allocation. And in light of these, the National Space Council developed and recommended a space traffic management policy. It's the first U.S. Space policy to address this issue. The Vice President talked about this briefly in Colorado. As the saying goes, it's on that large piece of furniture known as the President's desk. So I'm hoping we have an announcement fairly soon. It's been a productive process of discussing with the interagency, and I think we've reached a fairly good consensus. Now, as we look at this, this new policy sets priorities for SSA and space traffic management, which we hope encourage the growth of the commercial sector, establishes a modern space traffic architecture, promotes safety standards and norms across the international community, and it really will align agencies to do really what they're supposed to be doing best. The Commerce Department for talking to industry and interfacing with rapid changes, and the Defense Department is keeping of a single catalog, the authoritative catalog, but freeing up some of its time and attention to focus on space warfighting capabilities, which sadly are increasingly needed as we move forward. So we're getting the roles and missions of our agencies in alignment. As I had mentioned earlier, the domestic and international demand for mobile broadband continues to grow, and there are a lot of companies eager to provide services for this. I should mention that this is not unrelated to the competition for 5G. The role of China in 5G competition also has a space aspect to it, because in addition to our terrestrial communications industry, the United States has a strong and entrepreneurial satellite communications industry available to engage in global competition. And to ensure we retain the strategic advantages afforded by space services, the United States needs to continue to open and promote competitive markets and protect spectrum allocation for space services to compete. Since radio waves, as you know, don't stop at borders, unfettered terrestrial wireless network use in one country could certainly preclude the use of satellite services in neighboring countries. That would harm the global economy, and a global approach is necessary to protect U.S. space commerce. A logical solution would be for all countries to globally, or at least regionally, seek harmonized spectrum allocations for terrestrial and satellite services, pointing to the upcoming World Radio Conference in 2019. There's an urgent need to provide reasonable protections for satellite gateway earth stations in certain frequency bands, as well as protection for satellite end-user terminals in core satellite bands. And it's for these reasons the National Space Council is examining how the Department of State, Commerce, and FCC can better coordinate to ensure the protection and stewardship of spectrum necessary for space commerce. And again, not just for space purposes and its unique uses, but also to make sure that we're competitive in terrestrial areas as new technologies like 5G come along. Export controls, mentioned also earlier, need to be kept updated with advances in existing space sectors as well as new capabilities. Burden and outdated parameters can have the unintended effect of compromising national security by incentivizing space industries to move overseas and for manufacturers to change their supply chain. The Space Council is discussing how the administration might review items, components, technologies, and services related to civil and commercial space activities and spacecraft missions, and in particular providing more regular updates and reviews of those characteristics so we make sure that we don't fall behind the nature of the technology and markets. We're interested in hearing more, of course, from industry perspectives on how to ensure these regulations remain relevant and effective in a changing world, and again, more on that to come. In conclusion, the challenge of space leadership today is really to manage in the face of rapid change. And while we're facing new commercial and military competition, the most important factor affecting the U.S. in space is not really what other countries do, but what the United States chooses to do or fails to do. The National Space Council, with Vice President Pence's leadership, is committed to taking the initiatives necessary to sustain and expand a U.S. position of leadership in space. And thank you, and with that, I'm happy to take questions.
The gist of this question is, how do you regulate without crippling innovation? And it's obvious that there's great need for regulation below geostationary orbit. But if you begin to consider things like laser communication instead of RF, then the rules are completely different and, in a sense, much easier to generalize. And that extends even more so to beyond geo. How do you keep from crippling innovation when we are interested in permanent colonies on the moon? Because things such as nuclear propulsion and so on make a lot of sense for that application, and also getting to Mars in 30 or 60 days instead of a year.
Sure. Okay, a lot there. So one of the things I would say is the balance is you need to have a regulatory structure, but you should not try to make it more detailed than necessary. So we talk about a light touch regulation. You've heard maybe some of the concepts about mission authorization. To be wonky for a moment, Article 6 of the Outer Space Treaty says that member states, such as the United States, are responsible for providing authorization and continuing supervision to the activities of their nationals. Well, that can mean a full-up licensing regime, like remote sensing or commercial satellites, or it can mean a much lighter touch, such as a payload review and authorization. So when we look at emerging capabilities like private space platform or even satellite servicing, we can provide more of that light touch where there is an authorization, there is a government role, but we don't try to be overly prescriptive down to technical details in an environment that's still changing. So it's a matter of being, first of all, a little humble in the face of how quickly change is occurring, but not to go for zero, because that can mean a lack of predictability for the industry. Really dramatic changes such as laser comm are terrific because the sooner you can get out from under the kind of the constraints that the ITU and spectrum regulation traditionally gets you, and you get into a new area, that's of course a wonderful place to be. But in doing that, this also raises the need for norms of behavior, voluntary guidelines with other space entities that also may be doing laser communication. You don't want people shining lasers where you don't want them. Similarly, this is why the best practices I mentioned earlier are really important, because rather than having say a compulsory regulatory regime, developing voluntary best practices that countries can individually implement can adapt to this change more quickly. You mentioned nuclear power. The United States has been part of discussion of voluntary guidelines of use of nuclear power in space for many, many years. And what it essentially boils down to is we can do nuclear power sources in space. There's nothing internationally that would bar us. But what it does mean is we don't want to turn the reactors on until we're headed outward. We don't want what happened, of course, with the old Soviet radar satellites, coming back into Canada and spreading nuclear waste. And so you want to be very, very safe and protect the biosphere. You want to use those nuclear power sources, but only as they're headed outward. So I think they have a crucial role in space. I think we've developed a lot of these guidelines with our other international partners, and that national law and regulation will be sufficient to go from there going forward, as long as we don't put too heavy a hand on it. And back.
Thank you. Sandra Irwin with Space News. On the remote sensing industry, a lot of the companies are banking on government contracts to recoup their investment, and most of the spending in the government is from the intelligence community, military, DoD. So I was wondering if you have any thoughts on how they would be able to market their products being unclassified, and they insist that they only want to sell unclassified information. And does it have to be a change in the government, maybe being more open to unclassified remote sensing data as opposed to mostly classified?
I guess I would challenge the presumption a little bit. I mean, one of the reasons that National Geospatial Agency is a gigantic buyer of commercial data is precisely because it can be widely shared with friends and allies as opposed to classified data. So I think they're already fans of that kind of data. I think the tricky part is finding non-governmental customers for this data. And the government, of course, is quite good at processing the data and producing it into other products that it knows and uses. What has been more of a challenge, and I know has been long debated in the industry, is how far down the value chain to go. So if you switch from looking at this as a space issue, but more as a geospatial information technology issue, you find lots of other higher value-added products. And the question to which satellite companies want to integrate themselves down into those kind of market areas really is the challenge for them. If they want to remain purely satellite suppliers and selling essentially wholesale unclassified data, they can do that, but there's only going to be a relatively few buyers at that end, which is going to be largely the government. If they want to go in and be part of a value chain selling to more niche markets, which requires different expertise and therefore is hard, I think there are opportunities, higher value opportunities for those services, but of which the supply of the data itself is going to be relatively small, a part of it. So that's really a business structure decision that they're struggling with.
Thank you.
Okay, way in the back.
Yes, my name is Roger Cochetti. I'm an author for John Wiley Publishers on history of the satellite industry. And my question, you've a couple of times referred to the Outer Space Treaty, and it's a foundation. We all know that for the legal policy structure of activities in outer space today. But I wonder if you could discuss a little bit more the relationship between the Outer Space Treaty and this administration's goals and objectives in the military aspects of outer space. Obviously, there are things that are permitted and not permitted under the Outer Space Treaty, but you pointed out earlier that if there are going to be changes, they should be incremental, let norms develop, and then you can decide whether they should be taken into a treaty. But could you discuss a little bit more the vision of this administration, where you would see things, say, 10 years from now on the military domain? Because clearly there's a lot of rhetoric flying around about outer space being the next military domain, the next warfare domain, et cetera. Thank you.
Sure. Being the former professor that I am, I would refer you to the text of the National Security Space Strategy, the section on space and the National Space Strategy, which has actually some sections in it on multilateral cooperation and the need for that in all areas. Again, not just the military areas, but really across a range of activities in space, not just the Outer Space Treaty, but of course ITU, Missile Tech Control Regime, and so forth. So I think the view is that the United States views the current set of treaties as broadly permissive, and therefore we're able to do whatever it is we really want to do in space. What has changed is the nature of the adversary environment. So back maybe a decade or two ago, I think people still talked about space as a potential sanctuary, and what would the U.S. do or not do to change that. That discussion is gone. The discussion is gone, and it's gone because it's been changed by the actions, particularly of Russia and China and counter space systems. And I can refer you to the testimony from the intelligence and defense community as what's happened. So the first priority is to make sure that in this environment, which we are very reliant upon, that we are at least more resilient to making sure that it's not that satellite systems will ever be invulnerable, they won't be, but that the functions that we want them to carry out are going to be resilient against a wide form of challenge. And then that we have capabilities to respond across domain and other areas if necessary to any challenges or threats to that capability. So what you're seeing now is really a rethinking over the changes that have occurred, had been occurring for some time, but which now I think is more openly recognized in this administration. So I think you're seeing more open discussion of it. I think certainly an ideal situation for the United States is for space to remain a very peaceful and calm environment, because that is deeply in our national interest. And I think, as I've also said in other areas, one should not assume that because space is a warfighting domain that it's inevitable that war will occur there. We have nuclear combat skills and nuclear combat capabilities, and we have tried mightily for decades to make sure that deterrence is preserved and that we never use those weapons. And so I think preparing for and ensuring we have resilient systems and abilities to respond in order to deter and prevent warfare in space is, I think, our top priority. So I would hope in another 10 years that space continues to be a calm and peaceful and maybe even less cluttered environment where everybody can operate. But it's going to take more work to ensure that deterrence prevails in light of changing conditions. Dale.
A simple question. So that it can be recorded somewhere, right? Sounds good. Yes, of course. Question for you. In this world that we live in with the new space and space 2.0, we have still intentional jamming. And I wonder if there's anything that the administration, the Space Council, yourself, and the groups that you deal with are thinking about any new responses to intentional jamming.
Yeah. The short answer is I probably can't really respond with any deep substance on that. Certainly even unintentional jamming is actually a problem, and working to reduce that. Trying to get to a point where we can reduce the amount of unintentional jamming such that any actual and deliberate attempts of intentional jamming stick out and become very, very noticeable, I think is something that a lot of us would like to see. Because if there is intentional and open jamming, and you can assure yourself that it's not an accident, then you have a variety of options you can take depending on the state of international conditions against that. If, however, you have a rather noisy environment, then it becomes much more difficult. And this is one of the reasons why I think a lot of people, myself included, are very keen to keep satellite spectrum very clean and pristine, not simply for performance reasons, but because in a clean environment, any bad actor kind of sticks out fairly clearly, whereas if it's a really noisy environment, it's sometimes hard to find that actor. So good spectrum management is not only good for commerce, it's good for national security.
Joe Pelton, former Dean of the International Space University and also GW. Two issues were discussed early this morning. One was that of spectrum allocation, and the other one is orbital debris. On the issue of spectrum management, one of the things that's been discussed is the extent to which for the millimeter waves there could be sharing. Of course, that's not as a clean environment, but it's also given the preponderance of pressure for 5G, it looks like that satellites may have to do sharing, and just comments on that. And then also on orbital debris. I just got back from a conference in South Africa where it was proposed that we should have automatic deorbit commands that then would be validated each week to say, no, it's still operating, don't deorbit. Because some satellite systems, 40%, you've just lost communications capability to command the orbit. Just comment about any innovations we can make on orbital debris that makes sense.
I'd really want to make sure that a U.S. finger was on any button that did an automatic deorbit. Just me. I want to make sure we controlled that. I shouldn't comment about millimeter wave or some of the debris issues, because some of those things, in fact, are the subject of open rulemakings that the Commission is engaged in. What I think I can say is that it's really important that we have specific protections for satellite services. That the worst outcome is that we be uncertain about what the global standards are for protection of a satellite service. So one may agree or disagree about the protection level in a particular case, say with millimeter wave or particular rulemaking. But I think the larger issue is satellite services deserve, need, require, a protection limits that's true on a global basis, or at least as wide a regional basis as possible. Because unlike terrestrial systems, you really can't go administration by administration to work those things out. So I think at a very sort of high level, that the U.S. should support those kind of global protections in international environments with the subject of what they are to be part of our own national processes that we'll take in our positions into work. Yes? Okay. I was going to do.
Margaret Whitehead, Hudson trustee. Thank you for being here. Hudson is honored to have many major satellite CEOs here today and major American innovators. And I wonder what you can tell them and tell us about this time game that's going on in terms of this marvelous emerging industry that's so important to our country, and how the impulse to overregulate it or correct or reform this space policy how is all of that going to unfold with the industry itself and their impulses to get into space, and what is the Trump administration going to do about this?
Well, we want the commercial industry to thrive, and we want it to be a global leader because it serves a variety of our national interests, not only economic growth, but national security, and also the ability to shape and influence what the rules are in space. People have known my phrase, which rules are made by the people who show up, not by the people who stay behind. And so we need to show up, at these meetings and standards. I think that I think one of the biggest threats to the space industry is not a question of whether an agency or whatever is supportive or not. I think everybody is broadly supportive. What happens is really the coordination of it. So you can have people quite well-meaning going down a particular path on a standard or working a problem that can have an impact on the satellite side or space side that's simply not recognized. Or they attempt to apply a model that works in one domain of technology and try to misapply it to the space domain. And so, and of course, a natural reaction is, well, everyone always pleads why they're special. So a natural reaction is to say, well, just as another special interest group pleading as to why they should have separate treatment. Being able to actually go a little bit more technically deeper with the regulatory agencies and with the departments and agencies as to why you need to work certain problems differently on the space side than what you would do, say, in the terrestrial communication side or non-communications capabilities. I think that's really the hard question. The Space Council, I think, provides a good mechanism for doing that, for bringing that leadership to bear. But the leadership doesn't always know what's happening on the front lines in the industry and with the technology and out in the markets and cutting edge. I mean, that's not necessarily their job. So our job in the White House is to make sure we press the administration's agenda down, we adjudicate issues and conflicts that come up. So one of the ways that I would urge that industry can kind of help us in that regard is to go and engage with the departments and agencies. Go to your customers and go to the people in Defense Department and in NASA and in transportation and commerce and make sure that they know how their equities are being affected. Now, I would also say this is most effective if it's done as an industry-wide effort rather than an individual effort. When I was in the Commerce Department, the GPS market was just sort of starting. And one of the first things I said to the companies was, I'm not smart enough to understand all your competitive strategies with each other. What I need you to do is to go and form a trade association and come back to me with an industry position, because I'm not interested in favoring any one company or not. I'm interested in having an industry viewpoint that then the Commerce Department can then act on. So the importance of groups like the Satellite Industry Association, Tom, plug, and other groups to go into the department agencies, so that's how it then gets into the interagency, is when Commerce comes and says we got a problem, Defense says we've got a problem, then that's something that's easier for me to deal with. I can hear from industry, and I want to hear from industry, but I'm in a position where I first need to respond to what my boss wants and then what the departments and agencies are saying. But to the extent those departments and agencies become advocates, for an approach that is broadly shared across the industry, then it's much, much easier for us to engage.
Great. Well, thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you. Great. I want to thank Scott Pace for those characteristically deeply insightful remarks. We can see why the Vice President has entrusted him with the being Executive Secretary of the Space Council, which is a signature initiative of this administration, one that the President himself has entrusted our old friend, Vice President Mike Pence, with. And I can remember conversations with the Vice President going back to 1994, 1995 on space issues that we've had. So I want to thank you. Can't imagine a better way to launch our new Space 2.0 initiative. I want to thank everyone for being here. Thank our C-SPAN audience. We will adjourn now for lunch, and we will reconvene at 1:30 with the panel discussion. Lunch will be served right outside. Thank you very much.